Firstly, we have Lucy Aphramor, who uses they, them pronouns. And Lucy is a radical dietitian using nutrition narratives and their spoken word shows to share and co-create old and new approaches to public health that emerge from an anti-oppressive framework. Lucy's work is shaped by their many privileges, notably as a white, thin, middle-class professional. Their practice is informed by personal experience of troubled eating and trauma through extensive dietetic practice and teaching, plus performance work. Their thinking is indebted to many knowledge traditions and significantly equal sustenance feminism and Black scholarship. Secondly, we have Stuart Parkinson, who uses he, him pronouns. Dr. Stuart Parkinson is the Executive Director of Scientists for Global Responsibility, a UK-based organization with 700 members drawn from across the science and technology professions. Stuart started his career over 30 years ago as an engineer working in the arms industry before ethical concerns led him to switch to studying for a PhD in climate science. As part of Stuart's work for SGR, he has written numerous articles and reports on military involvement in science and technology and the alternatives, as well as coordinating associated campaign work. And our final speaker will be Ayo Olatunji, who uses he, him pronouns. Ayo Olatunji is a junior medic and community worker. During his studies at UCL, he organized within his Students' Union and the National Union of Students to challenge racism and Islamophobia within higher education, as well as challenging the eugenics housed in UCL's past and present. So we will start off with Lucy.
Sorry, folks. The old mute button trick. So thank you for organising this conference. Thank you, Myriam, for such an inspiring, really moving and educational talk. I'm really delighted to be here. And as Malak says, my background is that I'm a dietitian. And so I've got quite an ambitious title. What I'm interested in doing is looking at how can we use healthcare education, and particularly like science, thinking around science and medicine, to provoke demilitarization. And I want to start off by recognizing that there's a real, when I use the terms us and we, in this context, I'm talking about anybody who is having conversations around demilitarization and health or science. And that, of course, that we all come from different subject positions, and that it's really, really important to remember this, because one of the things of coloniality is to homogenize. So the images should describe myself. So I'm thin and white, I've got short hair, I'm in a blue checked shirt, and I've got black rimmed glasses on. And the picture is of a community garden on my slide. And what I'm going to show you is how I use food as the point of entry to this discussion. What I hope is that you'll be able to take your own particular subject area to do something similar. And I will also say that a lot of the concepts that I'm talking about today, I've learned outside of life sciences. I think, as Malak was saying, that I couldn't think in these ways until I discovered social sciences and just critical thinking, really, and that what I'd been taught of as critical thinking, in fact, was critical appraisal. And that's a very different thing. So if you're somebody who's new to these ideas, I hope you can get enough from it to be inspired to have more conversations and read further. And if you do feel that you're being a bit left behind, it might be because you're not familiar with the language and with these concepts. And that's because these concepts, if you're a STEM student, for me, these concepts weren't taught in STEM. So diet logic uses this idea that there's healthy foods and there's unhealthy foods. And these are very, very different things. And they're sort of held in position by a whole load of facts. And under the healthy, we get ideas that this particular food is healthy and therefore it's good. And connected with this in the sort of well-being agenda is the idea of fitness, which is seen as synonymous with thinness, with being non-disabled and with being sane. So all the things under this healthy column are things that are seen as making somebody morally superior. It's as if there's a moral virtue to being in good health, as if there's a moral virtue to being fit. And so this is known as diet logic, and it's certainly how I was taught to think about food when I trained as a dietitian. A lot of you will also have heard the term binary thinking. And what diet logic does is it ties us into a way of thinking that exists where one thing in a pair exists in opposition to the other. And one of these things is always better than the other, and one is always worse. And what I'm going to show is how this way of thinking leads to militarisation. So to link with my title, what I'm showing you is how the way that we think can rely on really deep frameworks that lead to hierarchy and that lead us to consider one way of thinking as superior to another. So diet logic or binary thinking, it organised itself around whiteness. And whiteness is, by whiteness, I mean, it's the values of often associated with white-bodied people, but it's also a system of thought and values. And this system of thought and values teaches those of us educated in its system to seek things like, to believe in something like objectivity. Now, in order for something to be objective, it means that it's abstracted from any context whatsoever. And that is just fanciful. It comes along with this idea of rationality and reason. Now, by rationality and reason, I mean, I think it's great when we've got a way of sifting through ideas and trying to make sense of them. But the way that rationality is used is that it doesn't value emotion. It doesn't value creativity. And continuing under this way of thinking, it gives us an idea of modernity. So modernity, again, is something that's held up as a way of, as a goal for the entire world. And the goal of modernity is a Eurocentric or a very Western development. It leads us to think in materialism, there is no spirituality. There's nothing sacred in materialism. And all of this gets bundled together as progress that is seen as necessarily good and valuable. And it also gets taught as science, as if there's only one way of doing science. And in actual fact, what we're talking about is Western science. So binary thinking is also, we can also think of binary thinking as white supremacy. And the first cut of white supremacy is to separate human nature from the rest of nature. And I think I've put this image up of, there's some scissors, and then there's 4 indigenous people stood in a tropical forest. And I've put this up to be memorable because binary thinking, it rests on division and separation. And whatever we can do to move towards an idea of interconnection, an idea of being situated in a particular land, in a particular time, with particular people around us, is a challenge to coloniality. And it's a challenge to this idea of Western science that says that knowledge that we create should be completely abstracted from a value system, from land, from time. So why does this matter? Why is this relevant to demilitarisation and war? White supremacy, it needs an other. It needs to divide what it sees as superior from what it creates as inferior. So it rests on division. It rejects interconnection, and it presumes materialism. So a quick example of materialism, for example, would be that if there's an olive tree growing somewhere, that in white supremacy and in colonial system and a capitalist system, the worth of the tree comes from what it can be traded for in cash when it's cut down. There is nowhere in that to land anything about where the tree has grown, about any deities associated with the tree, around any the particular lineage of the tree. And in fact, as the Western scientists, if I was to mention those, they're just seen as laughable. So this materialism, it splits off considerations of what might be sacred, considerations of spirituality that become seen as primitive and become mocked. And there's no way of making sense of those in white science as legitimate in their own right. And this is the logic of militarisation. So whiteness shapes a public health agenda. I've put this book up here. So this is a really popular book in critical circles. And what I want to mention is that it's not only one person who's thinking this, but it's supported and approved of and applauded by heaps and heaps of people, and it's not been problematized. And the title of the book is that food isn't medicine. And that is a colonial perspective, because food absolutely is medicine for a lot of people who think outside of a colonial perspective, who think within a global majority wisdom. And in this way, white science, white public health messages get imported into countries in a colonial way. And this is a scientific imperialism. So how do we transport the values of whiteness under the guise of doing good by health? And a really key to this is the idea of evidence-based practice, or EBP. So evidence-based practice is taught as the judicious use of the best available evidence. What is not taught is that the best available evidence is already decided within a system of whiteness. If there was a system that said, we're going to look at whatever treatment is available, we're going to look at all the different findings, and we're going to do our best to figure out what will be most helpful for collective healing and particular people and the well-being of the planet, that would be great. But evidence-based practice is an ideology that sees Eurocentric ideas as superior to global majority wisdom. So evidence-based practice, I was trained to think that evidence-based practice is neutral, it's objective, and that obviously it's fair and it's good, and that the West have a duty to make it globally available. That's scientific imperialism. So what can we do about this? How can we move away from this binary way of thinking into more entangled ways of thinking? There's masses and masses of scholarship in books, in podcasts, YouTube, loads. And I've just chosen 3 here. One Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown. And Adrienne Marie Brown has written loads, and really about how can we think collectively and work together for deep change. Blood Sugar looks at racial pharmacology and food justice in Black America by Anthony Ryan Hatch. And then Braiding Sweetgrass by an Indigenous botanist, Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Basically just de-skinned them, de-seeded them by taking the skins off.
I've got a bit of interference there.
An amazing source.
Okay. So there's also a recently released brilliant book, Belly of the Beast by Deshaun Harrison. And Destroying the World as We Know It, the title is taken from this book that looks at the politics of anti-fatness as anti-blackness. And again, if you're new to this idea, it can be, well, really shocking, I think, because we've been taught that an anti-fatness agenda is in pursuit of health. And I've just used an example here to help us think about it. At the moment, there's very few Indigenous dietitians in Australia. And the way that I was taught to respond to this would be, well, that means that we should increase numbers of Indigenous dietitians in Australia. But what Deshaun Harrison is encouraging us to do is to destroy the world as we know it. So another response might be, instead of trying to train Indigenous dietitians to fit into what already exists, could we dismantle dietetics? Could we have a new, I hesitate to use profession, but a new organisation that teaches Indigenous foodways? Or other responses, and some way of, some way of thinking differently, that our response is not just to keep in place what exists and to train people to work within that, but let's change the infrastructure of thought. I'm going to finish with a quote from Frantz Fanon, who says, "And the day when our human race has fully matured, it will not define itself as the sum of the inhabitants of the globe, but as the infinite unity of their reciprocities." And for me, that's something I keep in mind when thinking about health, because I think even the term health does not exist in a lot of Indigenous languages. And for me, I'm trying to think in a way where I sense health differently. A word I've come up with is the commonswell. So instead of thinking health as something that's attached to individuals, how can we think of vitality or aliveness in this very collective sense that always includes attention to earth-honouring ways as well? So I'll finish there. I hope there's something useful in it. And please feel free to get in touch with me afterwards if there's anything that you'd like me to pick up on for you. Thank you.